Welcome, reckoning friends. I am Reverend Dr. Lehel Molnár. I am the archivist at the Hungarian Unitarian Church Archives in Kolozsvár, Transylvania, which is also known in Romanian as Cluj-Napoca, Romania.
I'm Reverend Claudia Elferdink. I'm an American Unitarian Universalist minister and someone who loves history. I'm also a privileged white woman, and I'm in my home in Silver City, New Mexico. The Reckoning Project is careful to affirm our identities. Most of us here today from outside the US identify as Unitarians. The larger world understands Unitarian Universalism as an American tradition. International Unitarians do not feel included in the American name. So this is why we call our project Reckoning International Unitarian and Unitarian Universalist Histories. This is one careful step to decenter the United States.
Claudia and I have been collaborating internationally since 2013. We have been researching 19th century American, British, and Transylvanian Unitarian relations. The Reckoning International Unitarian and Unitarian Universalist Histories Project grew out of a widening circle of historians, church leaders, and ministers who share a commitment to raising oppressed and marginalized voices and uncovering hidden stories. We continually collaborate and strive to disrupt systematic racism, colonial oppression, and discrimination with true stories which shape Unitarian and Unitarian Universalist identities. The Reckoning Project focuses on a reckoning among our international religious communities.
At the beginning of COVID, we realized that this could be a unique opportunity to meet on the internet with so many of us sheltering at home, not attending conferences, or even going out. Many did not know each other before this project. The Reckoning Project focuses on reckoning among our international religious communities. Lehel and I share responsibility as coordinators for this volunteer reckoning project. Our whole effort is experimental, responding to your interests and participation. We now are a group of over 20 from Transylvania, the United Kingdom, the Philippines, Canada, Japan, and the United States. We include gender diversity, cultural diversity, and Indigenous people. We continually seek more diversity.
The wisdom of our elders is vital, and many have come forward. Our working group seeks additional participants of all ages. We all are the current keepers of Unitarianism and Unitarian Universalism faith we will pass on to the generation to come.
Today's webinar is our first project. We have chosen this Transylvanian Unitarian history because those in the West rarely hear Transylvanians tell their own stories from such hard times. Resisting and surviving in authoritarian times is profoundly timely in today's world. We are honored to have more than 205 people registered today. You are coming from Germany, Poland, India, Denmark, Belgium, Canada, Romania, the United Kingdom, and the USA. We are thrilled. Because of your interest, already we are planning 2 webinars next year. The topics are not final, but they will focus on resisting and surviving. After today, you will receive an email from the Reckoning Project. It will include a link for today's recording, a survey, an opportunity to join our contact list to learn about future projects, and our Reckoning email address. That's reckoninginterntionaluu@gmail.com. It's all lowercase, reckoning, INTLUU@gmail.com. You will see it in the slideshow at the end of our webinar, and I hope you enjoy the photos of Transylvania that you will see there also.
Your attending today, your criticism and your encouragement moves this project forward. It will become more fair and sustainable when we can offer stipends to moderators and presenters so people can afford to participate regardless of personal financial resources. If you are willing to offer financial support when we have set up a transparent way to receive grants and donations, please let us know using our Reckoning email contact. It will be on the closing screen, or you can use the chat now. It is only seen by our host, Reverend Dr. Meg Richardson.
Today you will hear voices with a variety of accents. You may have noticed that already. And you will also see different presentation styles. Our Transylvanian speakers generously share in English, not an easy tongue for many Hungarian speakers, just as Hungarian is not easy for most English speakers.
We welcome your presence, your curiosity, and your critique. You may write questions arising today in the chat. This will go directly to our host. At the end, she will send questions posed in advance during registration, and today's questions to our moderator, who will present them to the panel. We will answer as many as possible. After we end today, a screen will appear with more information about this project and our email contact. And please be patient as we evolve with this volunteer experiment. We are coming together in a new way, filled with possibility.
Even with everyone speaking English, it can be difficult to understand our words. We do not speak English alike. Closed captions are available. There should be an option at the bottom of your screen. We want to truly listen to each other. Our diversity is obvious and is our strength. Please listen with an open heart and mind. Reverend Dr. William Schulz is our moderator today. He generously brings his experience as Executive Director of Amnesty International, the UU Service Committee, and the recent lecturer for the acclaimed Men's Lectures in Boston. As the former president of the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1989, during the fall of communism, Dr. Schulz increased American engagement with and awareness of Transylvanian Unitarians. So now we go to our moderator, Reverend Dr. Schulz in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Claudia, and welcome to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I want to thank Claudia and Lahel for organizing this webinar, as well as Mark Harris. I want to thank the Starr King School for the ministry for co-sponsoring it, and Meg and Ken for providing our excellent technical support. My contact with the Unitarian churches in Eastern Europe, and I should say not just in Transylvania, but in Hungary and in the former Czechoslovakia, and even with a nascent group in Poland, began in 1979 when I was the executive vice president of the UUA, and lasted until the end of my UUA presidency in 1993. During those 14 years, I regularly traveled into these countries, often carrying with me such scarce commodities as Western pharmaceuticals and religious publications, including the Bible. The most important of these journeys took place in January 1990, 3 weeks after the start of the Romanian Revolution. The previous fall, I had determined to try to signal to the Ceausescu government that high officials in the West were monitoring how it was treating our Unitarian communities in Transylvania. I had therefore asked a member of the United States Congress and a member of the Canadian Parliament to accompany me to Bucharest. Little did any of us know, of course, when we planned the trip, that we would arrive in Bucharest about 3 weeks after Ceausescu had been overthrown and executed and a new government was in place. This visit in January 1990 was the first opportunity that the new Romanian government would have to meet with Western officials, and our delegation secured commitments from them to increase religious freedom for all the religious communities in the country. But for our Unitarian Universalist purposes, the importance of this visit was that it was the occasion for the launching of what became subsequently known as the Partner Church program. After I left the UUA, I became executive director of Amnesty International USA, the human rights organization, and I had opportunity to interact with totalitarian governments of all stripes, as well as with brave dissidents who challenged those governments and often paid a high price for their courage. I know it's not easy for individuals or institutions to risk their lives for their principles. Most people choose to avoid conflict with authorities, and that is true of most religious institutions as well. Throughout history, religion has generally been a protector of the status quo, and only occasionally has it led the revolution. Well, today we have a special opportunity to learn about one who challenged the authoritarian government and others who accommodated themselves to it. I'm going to introduce our two principal speakers now. Judith Gellard will speak first. Judith, who is known to many of us as Zizi, grew up in Transylvania as a daughter of a Hungarian minister scholar, martyred by the communist purge of intellectuals during the Ceausescu regime. She graduated first from a music conservatory as a violinist and then from medical school. She specialized in neurology and psychiatry and practiced medicine in Transylvania and Budapest for 20 years. She married California professor George Williams and moved to the United States in 1988. The Starr King School for the Ministry awarded her an honorary doctorate in 1994. In 2002, she graduated summa cum laude from the Boston University School of Theology and was ordained by the Transylvanian Unitarian Church. She was instrumental in publishing her father, Dr. Imre Gellert's vast scholarship in both English and Hungarian. And our second principal presenter will be Reverend Sandor Kovacs, who is Associate Professor of the Protestant Theological Institute in Kolozsvár. He served as minister of the Third Unitarian Church of Kolozsvár, and he teaches at the seminary there. He earned his PhD from the University of Szeged in Hungary in 2008. His thesis is about Hungarian, English, and American Unitarian relations in the 19th century. He was the second Balas Scholar at Starr King School for the Ministry between 1995 and 96, and visiting professor there from January to June 2015. Now, just a few ground rules here. We have 6 interesting speakers, and we have a limited amount of time. And so I am going to have to be, in a friendly way, somewhat assertive with regard to our time. Each of our principal speakers has 15 minutes. At the end of 14 minutes, you will hear this chime. And that will indicate that you have about 1 minute more to go to speak to us. So Zizi, I want you to begin first and to model for us how you present in 15 minutes, which is a much longer and very dramatic story. Our first speaker, Judith Gellard.
So the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference, said Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel. He also said, we have no right to deprive future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget would be not only dangerous, but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. Nearly 2 generations have grown up since the communist nightmare in our homeland, and indifference is already setting in. Yes, it is uncomfortable to face a painful collective past. In this light, this webinar has an even greater importance. I am deeply grateful for inviting me to speak about my father as a dreadful case study. I also congratulate our American Unitarian friends for helping save the memory of countless nameless victims from the erosion by indifference. The story of my father is both typical and extreme. It gives you the full spectrum of victimization by the Securitate and by then corrupt Unitarian Church. While several ministers of our church were imprisoned, it was my father whom the Securitate kept under surveillance and continuous intimidation even after his release from prison. In fact, the rest of his life. The only freedom left for him was to take his own life on his 60th birthday. This was his ultimate protest against dehumanization. Let me highlight some crucial events of my father's life. In 1969, in our village of Transylvania, where my father was a minister, we were preparing for his doctoral award ceremony just in 2 weeks. 7 years of intense scholarly work would finally be rewarded. The doctoral degree would automatically lead to the professor's chair at the Unitarian Seminary of Kolozsvár. Friends were invited to the parsonage for a dinner party to celebrate. Now, earlier on that day, my father's trusted parishioner, with whom he listened to the Radio Free Europe, warned him about his imminent arrest. He was the betrayer, but he was generous to give his minister the clue, thus chance to hide his precious manuscripts, his doctoral dissertation and 2 novels. Not to jeopardize anyone, my father simply hid them under the floor of the attic. The black car of the Securitate had long arrived, waiting for the guests to leave the parsonage. Then the thugs broke into the bedroom of my parents and my little brother. After a house search that ravaged our home, my father was kidnapped. These were the most feared times of those years. People disappeared from their home overnight, always at night. Some never came back. Well, my father did. 5 years later, unrecognizably old at 45, broken in body and spirit. Let us have a glimpse into the political prisons of Romania. The black car took my father to the most feared Securitate detention center in Kolozsvár for interrogation. It lasted for 6 months without a trial. This was the time to break the victim with physical and psychological torture, and in my father's case, with additional psychotropic drugs. He wrote, "I don't really remember much except for the overwhelming fear. I lost track of time, and in the apathy of my depression, living or dying made no difference. Besides, we did not know which was in store for us. The tortures made us rehearse our confession at the future trial. Also, they tried to force me to sign a document of denouncement against my minister friend. The conceptual trial was short and the verdict preconceived. Imre Gellerd was sentenced for 7 years of prison and forced labor with an additional 5 years of losing his civil rights. 7 incriminating sentences in 7 sermons equaled 7 years of imprisonment. God's kingdom, for instance, was a coded allusion to America. After the trial, he disappeared from our life. We did not know even whether he was alive. He told us the story later about the prison only once. It was too dangerous and too painful to talk about it. The first year in the Szamosújvár prison turned into a strange academy where illustrious professors, bishops, writers, artists shared our large cell for 100 inmates. The prison guards called them bandits. They carried an intense intellectual life of teaching and learning. They measured time in Christmases away from their families and in languages they learned. They confessed that deprivation from writing was as great a suffering as the lack of food. Soon, however, those prisoners found themselves in the Danube Delta's infamous forced labor camps, the Gulag of Romania. For the next 4 years, this hell became their home. The camp's dormitory was one huge space in the bottom of a discarded French towboat. Some 500 people were jammed here in bunk beds. The name of this ship jail dormitory was Liberté. Liberté. The forced labor, cutting reed in the swamp, for example, took its victim by the hundreds. Dysentery and typhoid fever in the lack of medicine decimated the prison population. One time, my father was considered a hopeless case and thrown into the so-called agony chamber to die. The Securitate was inventive in its methods of torture. One day, my father had an unknown visitor. He came to deliver a news, a very bad news. In our grandparents' town, he said, he witnessed a tragic triple funeral. He described in details how my mother committed extended suicide, killing her 2 children, my 8-year-old brother and me, 12, before murdering herself. In shock, my father now ran toward the high voltage electric fence. This was a common way of suicide in the camp, and suicide was a clean murder. After 5 years, as a result of political pressure from Amnesty International, all political prisoners were granted grace and released in 1964. Freedom, however, became an unexpected existential crisis for many of them. The true shock for the ex-prisoners, however, was that the world's complete indifference toward them. Now, as they resurfaced, the world ignored them. No welcome, no recognition by the church and society of their heroism, having lived through hell, yet resisting the Securitate's attempt to corrupt and turn them into informers. Thus, they saved many lives. The indifference of the outside world called into question the meaning of their sacrifice on others' behalf. These people who managed to preserve their own integrity suddenly questioned the very meaning of their life. Many of them had no place to live and no income to start a new life. Some no longer had a family to return to. My father was one of those. He lost everything, his family and his beloved congregation, his health and his home, his scholarly achievements and professorial career. He lived 15 more years alone in inner exile in a small village, unresponsive to his intellectual, spiritual challenges. Yet he continued serving his beloved church, which silenced and marginalized him. He wrote a new doctoral dissertation, but for the second time, church officials, in collaboration with the state, prevented him from receiving the degree. Only posthumously, 25 years later, that he received his earned Doctor of Divinity title. In the new exile, he kept writing pairs of sermons, filled his draws with theological essays, novellas, songs, and educational material. But the church banished him from teaching or publishing. One of the greatest Unitarian preachers and theologians, he was totally marginalized, a pariah. Later, the entire body of his writings have been published, and the latest was published by the Unitarian Church on his 100th anniversary of his birth, a magnificent collection of his sermons and theological papers, theological studies. Our family shattered. My mother was blackmailed and coerced to divorce my father while in prison, and in order to keep her two young children out of Romania's infamous orphanages. After my father's imprisonment, the church evicted us from the parsonage, our only home. My mother courageously took up her studies again as a medical assistant and moved into a boarding school with her young son. She was very poor, but with great courage and ambition, she would eventually become a respected teacher in her alma mater. And for the next 25 years, the Securitate never stopped harassing her. As a child, I was forced to disown my political prisoner father in order to continue my studies in an elite music conservatory. I was hidden in the school far from home, where my Jewish violin teacher protected me from expulsion, thus risking her own job. In 2006, the Romanian secret police archives released the files on my father, 1,400 pages of horror about betrayals, lies, coercions. My father's Securitate code name was Prophetul, the prophet, the prophet. Interestingly enough, my alma mater, Boston University, is called the School of Prophets, since its famous graduate, Martin Luther King. The files reveal the causes of my father's tragic death. He was facing another imminent arrest. His suicide was an ultimate political protest. I had the privilege to be the student of Elie Wiesel for 3 years while studying at BU. Professor Wiesel charged me to write the life story of my father and our family. He guided me throughout accomplishing my first book, Prisoner of Liberté. In summary, a few words about the quest for freedom. While the difference between victims and victimizers should be clear as in Elie Wiesel's imperative, we must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim, he said. However, the secret police file sheds an ambiguous light on those human tragedies on both sides. Both were ordinary people, and some, as in my father's case, close friends. The one who released compromise, the one who resisted compromise and refused collaboration to harm a best friend, ended up in prison and sacrificed his family. The other managed to stay out of prison by accepting the debasing role of informer on close friends. But he would be shackled by shame and guilt. So which was freer? Having lived behind the Iron Curtain for the first 4 decades of my life, I was keenly aware of our condition under a coercive and controlling totalitarian rule. In the culture of the lie, we protected our inner freedom at any price. No dictator had access to this core. I must risk saying that we were freer then than most Americans are today. Being aware of our condition of the lack of freedom made us strong. Americans are vulnerable because of their assumptions about the perpetual and automatic nature of freedom. Freedom is never free, not for us Hungarians. Americans seem to underplay their responsibility to protect their freedoms. We, once victims, must warn them about the creeping nature of totalitarianism. We must also ask ourselves who we are as citizens and what is our responsibility to keep our institution of freedom strong. Thank you very much.
Zizi, thank you so much for your very, very poignant and touching story. And now we're privileged to hear from Professor Sandor Kovacs.
I'm very honored to be part of this webinar, and I heartily welcome all participants. I have to confess that I'm not the best expert on this proposed subject. On my presentation, I partly rely on the research of the best Hungarian-speaking Unitarian specialist, colleague, friend, and former student, Reverend Dr. János Pál. 32 years after the collapse of the totalitarian regime, there are only a handful Hungarian language articles and book detailing the activity of the Unitarian Church during that period. I would like to comment on 2 words in the title of the webinar: resistance and survival. In the context of totalitarianism, active or passive resistance had several aspects. However, survival is mostly about cooperation and collaboration with the oppressors. The question is not whether the church cooperated with the oppressors or resisted them, but how the church cooperated for its own survival. I will briefly summarize the relationship between the Unitarian Church and the totalitarian state between 1945 and 1989. Each period needed different church strategies towards the regime. The history of communism in Romania can be divided into 5 phases in terms of its impact on the Hungarian minority, including the Unitarian Church. First, transition period from 1945 to 1948. Between 1940 and 1944, about 100,000 Hungarians left southern Transylvania, then Romania, of whom only 50% settled in northern Transylvania, then Hungary. The deportation of more than 100,000 Hungarian-speaking Jews by the authorities obedient to the Nazi orders, and a large number of other refugees in northern Transylvania significantly changed the social structure and ethnical and demographic position of the Hungarians in Romania. Second, the period of Stalinist integration, 1948-1956. The year 1948 marked the successful consolidation of the political power of the Romanian Communist Party. This was the start of the decline and the gradual loss of church influence over society. The restrictions of freedom and the extension of control over the church were laid down in Law of Education and the Law on Religious Denominations, promulgated on 1948. According to the law, individuals seeking church leadership position through elections had to be vetted by the Great National Assembly, which was the Communist Party-controlled parliament, and take an oath of allegiance to the regime, swearing to defend the country against its internal and external enemies, ensuring that they and their subordinates would respect the laws of the People's Republic and would not engage in activities that contravened to the new political order. From 1948 onwards, the mechanism of supervision and control was extended. The Ministry of Religious Affairs intervened in the legislative and decision-making work of the church and placed it under close surveillance. The representatives of the Ministry of Religious Affairs became permanent participants in the church decision-making forums. Church policy was no longer primarily determined by the competent church bodies, but by the Ministry of Religious Affairs, which transmitted the Communist Party's instructions and monitored their implementation. With the suppression of the religious education, which meant national identity as well, the church became less and less similar to an institution that has its own values and it's independent from the socialist regime. In order to survive, the church had to cooperate with the new system. But this led to a breakdown in the balance of power, which increased the state's power over the church affairs in other areas. Prearranged and influenced church elections allowed the state to fill the church decision-making and governing bodies at various levels with collaborators to stifling its control over the church. Third, the period of total control of society, 1957-1965. In Central and Eastern Europe, in the 1950s, mass demonstrations and strikes broke out against the repressive policies of the communist dictatorship of Russian-controlled governments. In Hungary, a strong decentralization movement for freedom of expression and national independence was launched. On 23rd October 1956, a popular uprising broke out in Budapest. The heroic but hopeless resistance was suppressed by 14th November. No revolutionary struggles took place in Romania, but student demonstrations were organized in sympathy with the Hungarian Revolution. For the Romanian communist dictatorship, the Hungarian Revolution provided an excellent pretext for eliminating the minority elite of Romania. Between 1956 and 1964, more than 32,000 Romanian citizens were imprisoned, sentenced to forced labor, or moved to forced housing. The same events provided a good opportunity for the activation of the state police surveillance services. The expansion of the networks of informers particularly targeted two social categories: the clergy and the teaching profession, whose representatives were suspected of stirring up the youth against the regime. During the repressions, 18 Unitarian ministers, theological students, and professors were sentenced to forced labor or imprisonment, a total of 174 years. Between 1957 and 1964, at least 96 Protestant ministers and theological students were arrested and sentenced for hostile manifestation against the state. Fourth, the period of relaxation and apparent liberalization, 1966-1971. After the election of Nicolae Ceausescu as first secretary of the Communist Party of Romania, there followed a period characterized by a policy of general relaxation, which brought a relative liberalization of the Communist Party's policy towards minorities. Despite the appearance of liberalization, the Communist Party's policy in relation to the Hungarian minority remained two-faced. In his address to the 9th Congress of the Communist Party of Romania, held on July 1965, Ceausescu refers to the national problem as a matter definitively resolved. Despite this statement, the period is characterized by a series of contradictory measures. The new constitution, adopted in August 1965, reintroduces the term of co-inhabitant nationalities, and the Commission is re-established to deal with the problems of national minorities. In 1967, a new administrative territorial reorganization is introduced, which does not take into account the options of the Hungarian minority. In June 1968, Ceausescu refuses to accept the need to adopt a new statute for the Hungarian minority, as well as some concessions regarding Hungarian language education. However, at the October meeting of the Communist Party, he pleads for the extension of linguistic rights for minorities in education and in several areas of cultural life. At the same meeting, it is decided to set up the Council of Hungarian Working People in Romania. The purpose is the political integration and assimilation of the Hungarian minority elites. In 1970, some media organs with great impact on the cultural life of the Hungarian minority are established. In 1961, the Unitarian journal entitled Christian Seed Sower was relaunched. In parallel with these developments, a skillful policy of Romanization of the areas inhabited mainly by the Hungarians was launched by continuing the process of industrialization. Fifth, the period of communist nationalism, 1972-1989. The program of communist nationalism, promoted with insistence by Ceausescu, aimed to create an ethnically homogeneous state through a policy of forced assimilation. The gradual elimination of what remained of the Hungarian language education network blocking or limiting the access of Hungarians to certain profession, for example, ministry, the ethnic homogenization of the towns with a Hungarian character in Transylvania, the plan called systematization, which meant demolition of towns and villages with the stated goal of turning Romania into a multilaterally developed socialist society, were important elements on the forced assimilation program. In parallel with these efforts, the aim was to cleanse the public space of everything that had to do with minorities. Since 1985, the notion of co-inhabitant nationality has gradually disappeared from public discourse, its place being taken by the term Romanian workers of Hungarian origin. In 1948, the Romanian TV territorial editorial offices stopped broadcasting in minority languages. Materials on the history of nationalities were withdrawn from museum collections. And from 1988 onwards, the names of localities could only appear in Romanian in the press and all national minority publications. As the economic situation deteriorated and living standards fell, anti-Hungarian propaganda became increasingly aggressive. Members of the Hungarian community reacted to the acceleration of this process by emigrating en masse, clandestinely or legally, to Hungary or the West. There are known cases in which the repressive actions of the Securitate drove several members of the community to suicide. Conclusion. I believe that history does not justify the knights in shining armor fighting the windmill, nor those who bowed their backs and collaborated, but testifies the church as a wise institution in which barricade fighters and collaborators, peace bishops, and the underground spiritually free church have always been able to exist at the same time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Shondor. These have been two excellent presentations to get us off to a fine start in these webinars. So we are very fortunate to have 4 respondents, each of whom will speak for no more than 5 minutes. I'm going to introduce all 4 of them now, and they will speak in the order in which I've introduced them. First, we have Aryan Babcock, who is the Pastoral Care Learning Fellow at the Church of the Larger Fellowship. A graduate of Starr King School for the Ministry, Aryan brings to the Unitarian Universalist community her experience as a history teacher and a religious cultural anthropologist, emphasizing Proto-Indo-European polytheistic practices. She is the co-creator and content producer for the Spiritual Daily Minute and 3 Minutes in UU History on YouTube. As an indigenous person of North America, she considers the work of reckoning and looking into the face and places that make us uncomfortable and to really see the past in color as part of her ministry. Our second respondent will be the Reverend Andrew Hill. Andrew is a birthright British Unitarian of several generations, has been minister of Unitarian churches in Liverpool, Ullett Road, and Edinburgh at St. Mark's Unitarian Church there from 1974 to 2007. He is a former secretary of the British Unitarian Historical Society and edited Celebrating Life, a British Unitarian Manual of Special Services, and the British Unitarian Purple Hymn Book, Sing Your Faith. He has twice been to Transylvania in 1968 and secondly in 1997. Our third respondent is Reverend Judit Gellerd, the President and Executive Minister of the UU Church of the Philippines. Her ministry has brought strong engagement on climate justice and social justice in the 25 churches and fellowships she serves. She's worked with over 40 non-governmental organizations, which include labor unions, farmers, LGBTQA, and women's groups. At age 16, she helped topple the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos with her participation in the famous bloodless revolution of only 3 days. And she was the Balash Scholar at Starr King School for the Ministry from 2016 to 17. And our final panelist will be Reverend Kinga Rika Shaklee, born in 1972, raised in a small village in Transylvania, where she stayed until she was 13, when she was sent to Kalashvar to school with her older sister. She was later admitted to seminary, and upon graduation in 1995, she was appointed an intern with a congregation in Homoradchenpeter, and then was elected by the congregation to be their minister. And she was one of the first women ordained ministers in Transylvania. She also pursued her studies in St. Paul, Minnesota, supported by the partner church, Unity Church of St. Paul, and spent the academic year of 1999-2000 in Berkeley at the Starr King School for the ministry. Let's start with Aryan Babcock and go on to Andrew, Tet, and Kinga.
Thank you. I appreciate the introduction. I'm Aryan Babcock, and I'm going to ask for your indulgence because the power is out here in Okinawa, Japan. So I'm going to be referring to my notes by candlelight. So we'll make it work. So history is alive only when we work to keep the mistakes of the past from happening again. Otherwise, history is a dead thing that just sits there. So I pondered that as I thought about who we are as Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists, as global citizens, who we are in our individual countries and in our individual experiences, and how we must work to protect what we believe in. The idea that apathy and indifference is everywhere was profound. And when I read it, it landed really solidly on my shoulders because I felt that truth, especially at the time of the experience of COVID and what it means in the world, and people just don't seem to care. You know, how is that, how do we take our strengths and change that? How do we take today's prophetic witness, these stories and these histories, and we use them as a beacon? Like, how is that a catalyst to act? We can't just let these stories be told. We can't let them be forgotten. We must work to also battle back that creeping evil. I could go on and on about headlines every single day that showcase that the creeping evil still exists, but how are we jolted out of our apathy? I find that we as Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists, we don't have an excuse not to act. Our same energy that is gifted to us in our questioning theologies and in our considering faith tells us that we need to act, that we can't just lean back or let things flow by. That is the work of being a Unitarian or a Unitarian Universalist in the world. And that is what it means to be a global community. We need to not center ourselves, but we need to do the work daily to ensure that the voices on the margins are heard. And if they're heard, not forgotten, that we need to keep questioning and keep questing toward truth, toward what it means to live into the world as Unitarians, to make the world better for everyone, not just ourselves. And that's a hard challenge. And where do we want that line of freedom to be? That's the questions that I came away from listening, from reading and then listening today to these stories. So I ask you as I close out, because I'm reading from notes and keep looking down and feel that's disrespectful. I ask you today, what do we do? What do we do? History alive and not let it be a dead thing. How are we going to work? How are we going to work to keep apathy and evil from creeping forward? I thank you for your time and I thank you for listening and your indulgence for my power outage.
Thank you so much, Aryan, and good luck to you with your power. Andrew.
Good evening, everybody. Or at least it's evening here. First of all, may I thank Shondor for his presentation and also Judith for hers. And I very much appreciated being able to read Judith and Yandos Powell's paper earlier. Judith's talk about her father I found intensely moving, especially as I too am a minister's child. But at the same time, noting that her father was but one of several Transylvanian Unitarian ministers deprived of their freedoms during the communist period in Romania. It hardly bears comparison, but living as I do presently in York in the north of England, I recall that during the late 17th century, persecution of clergy dissenting from the established Church of England was rife. 2,000 of them were rejected, and several of whom were imprisoned either in York Castle or in the York Town Jail, including Ralph Ward, the very first minister of the Unitarian congregation to which I now belonged. I've been twice to Transylvania, once in the suppressed period and once since. My first visit was in 1968, many years ago now, when 8 young Western European Unitarians drove from Frankfurt to Kołobrzeg for the 400th anniversary of the Edict of Torda. It was my only experience of life beyond the so-called Iron Curtain as we knew it. Our first stop was Prague. It was the Prague Spring. The curtain was briefly withdrawn and the locals were reveling in newly acquired freedoms. We drove on across Hungary and over the Carpathians into Romania and down to Kołobrzeg. We stayed with local Unitarian families, enjoyed the company of the local Unitarian youth, endured an endless Romanian rant from a state official followed by an outspoken response from the UUA's Dana McLean-Grayley. I think it was still the AUA then, wasn't it? And climbed toward a mountain where David Ferenc is buried for endless speeches in the pouring rain. I don't know if any of you were there to experience that, but it was the return journey which memorialized the pilgrimage. It was tragic. We overheard that Soviet Russian forces were on the move. At a level crossing, we met with a trainload of tanks. In Budapest at the Unitarian Church, the Czechs were glued to the radio. The British Embassy advised, don't panic, but don't hang around. Safely home in Edinburgh, I caught up with the news from Prague and watched newsreels of Soviet troops in Wenceslas Square, where I had been only a few days previous. The Iron Curtain was closed again. My second visit was 1997 for the Bishop George Enyedi conference. Hungarian Airlines lost my baggage. We had a special train all the way from Budapest to Kołobrzeg, part of Hungarian government policy supporting Romania's Hungarian minority. The conference was primarily academic, but the Unitarians had a special session of their own after the academics had left, with the announced theme, Unitarian answers to the challenges at the end of the 20th century. And I was expected to speak. But what challenge? Well, as it happened, I would be back home in Edinburgh, where I lived and ministered for 33 years, just in the nick of time to vote in the 1997 Scottish devolution referendum. So I spoke about the place and rights of people of minority cultures living within the bounds of a dominant majority. That surely was an end of the century challenge, which my audience could readily translate from my political culture to theirs. And I understand that my talk was favorably mentioned in the Seed Sower, the Transylvanian Unitarian magazine. Finally, I'm grateful for this opportunity to respond, and my thanks to all those who have organized this event.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Tet?
Thanks, Bill. It's an honor to be with you all, Judith and Lahel, Sandor. Sia, Tet Gallardo Bayok, Reverend. Is that good Hungarian? So, thanks to the Transylvanians, I've become a Balash scholar and studied at Starr King. And now I am once again indebted to you for your enormous contributions to our common history. Khrushchev and Kennedy once met back in the 1960s at the beginning of the space race, and Kennedy told Khrushchev, "Our Hungarians are better than your Hungarians." Even then, Hungary was already subjected to the Cold War. Thanks to your presentations, it is very clear to me that it is possible sometimes the clash is not between cultures or ideologies, but between democratic and anti-democratic forces. Some leaders are fearful, some are fearless. The fearful ones create a throne of opacity where no light can expose them and no light can be shed on them either. Leaders today struggle with democratic mechanisms, circumventing not to streamline processes to better serve the people, but to shield themselves from accountability. We may be in democratic countries and even churches, but still ailing with tyrannical tendencies. Leaders are shielding themselves from the real discourse and insulating themselves from learning moments. Thus, after the knowledge explosion that gave rise to the knowledge economy, we now find ourselves in the great learning crisis. Noam Chomsky said that part of the whole technique of disempowering people is to make sure that the real agents of change fall out of history and are never recognized in the culture for what they are. So it's necessary to distort history to make it look as if great men did everything. That's part of how you teach people they can't do anything. They're helpless. They just have to wait for some great man to come along and do it for them, unquote. When we believe our heroes and leaders are extraordinary people, we do not credit the stories to whole cultures, tribes, or supporters that make them possible. I was 16 when I participated in the only successful bloodless revolt of the people in this century. Sorry, in the 20th century. The streets were filled with heroes, and that's how I knew heroism is not scarce. What is scarce is the skill to collaborate. We went to the streets and successfully ended the 20-year dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. And I really relate with what Sandor was also saying about the difficulties of establishing democratic institutions. German President Christian Wolff said our EDSA people power was an inspiration for the Germans to stand up and unify for peace and freedom. The Philippine People Power Revolt influenced a number of other popular revolts in South Korea, Burma, China, and Indonesia, at least. Even Václav Havel, the revolutionary idol of the Czechoslovakian uprising in 1989 and later president of the Czech Republic, said during a 1995 visit to the Philippines that the people power revolt we did was an inspiration to him and his fellow Eastern European dissidents. Even where the origins of the term people power were forgotten, commentators applied it to uprisings such as in Serbia in 2000, Georgia in 2003, Tunisia and Egypt in 2011, and Ukraine in 2014. But it is to be recalled that Hungary showed the earliest manifestation of people power in Eastern Europe with the Hungarian uprising in 1956. In his 2007 book, 12 Days, The Story of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, Victor Sebastian wrote, more than 250,000 people massed into Budapest's Parliament Square on the evening of 23 October 1956 in a show of people power that terrified Hungary's communist leaders and their masters in the Kremlin. The spontaneous, unplanned demonstration was entirely peaceful. But today, no leader trembles at peaceful revolts anymore. Their thrones have become impenetrable with the apathy that Elie Wiesel described. Out of fear, they have built their walls, their fortresses from the people. Fear is the root of all evil. I must give special applause to our Unitarian leaders who keep the flame alive with a fearless quest for truth and meaning, and insist that we learn and keep learning from each other as equals. People learn better in the context of relationships or communities of practice we know as cultures. By defending democracy, we defend learning communities. Kosonom Sepen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. And your Hungarian is a lot better than mine, so thank you very much. And our final respondent is Kinga. And I'll bet she can speak Hungarian better than either of us.
Isten áldjon.
You see?
Dear friends, I greet all of you gathered here for this webinar. I was so very pleased when Lehel Molnár approached me to be part of the panel for this webinar. How wonderful. Finally, someone is paying attention to the horror that went on during the dictatorship here in Romania. But as we got closer to this date, my enthusiasm perished away. I am not enthusiastic anymore. I am sad, deeply sad. Many bad memories came back as I was thinking what should or shouldn't display in these 5 minutes I was given on this panel. First of all, I stuck with the expression survived from the title, how the Unitarians survived. And well, my answer was, well, some did not survive. Gellerd Imre hasn't survived. And I can say my father hasn't survived because he went away having a final heart attack in 1992 at the age of 43. I was born in 1972. I spent my first 13 years in the village where my father was the minister. Then, together with my older sister, I was sent to Kolozsvár to follow my high school studies. We stayed with our grandma and our auntie and her husband. Me and my sister stayed with our grandma in one room, and we went home only during holidays. After 1989, it helped me a lot to talk about the fear, the cold, the need we went through in the 1980s. But after having my own children amid relatively comfortable life conditions, I realized how hard it is for them to actually realize how my life and the life of the people who lived under the dictatorship was. Frankly, I am convinced neither my children nor the rest of the younger generations cannot perceive how brutal the communist system was. They just don't get it. There are some false allegations regarding the political system in Hungary these days. Some say there is dictatorship in Hungary, and I ask, do these people know what dictatorship means? Dictatorship means the ordinary people and those who are called the enemy of the system cannot eat normally, as we couldn't eat normally in the 1980s. If you did not belong to the system's folks, you stayed in line every morning for a liter of milk. You stayed in line every morning for a half load of bread on tickets. You stayed in line for your 1 liter oil per month, 1 kilo sugar per month, 1 piece of butter per month. And you saw orange and bananas only before Christmas time. And your electricity, even in the big cities such as Kolozsvár was off 2 or more hours every evening, not only today as you have it Aryan Babcock. And there was no gas in the pipes every winter evening for hours. And of course, it is just in vain to tell about these years we went through, because I'm kind of convinced that nor my children, neither the other young people, they just don't have, they just can't understand what was going on. One of my classmates in Kolozsvár had parents serving the system. I enjoyed visiting them a lot. There was chocolate, there was coffee, there was plenty of bread. But it took me weeks to make my classmate understand that the majority of the people get their food on tickets. My classmate just wouldn't accept this fact in the beginning, but later. In the village where we lived, the parsonage didn't have indoor plumbing. Needless to say that my children cannot understand this. The parsonage didn't have it, but the elite of the village, the party leaders, had bathrooms in their homes. I'm going to share one personal story and then I will finish, because if I see I'm kind of over 5 minutes. I was 12 years old when an ex-classmate of my parents came to visit us. He emigrated to Hungary and worked for the Hungarian embassy in Romania. He was very generous when he came. He brought chocolate, coffee, and all kinds of foods and many books. It was a Sunday. Afternoon, I went to the neighbor's village. There was a big festival, something with 1st of May. The local police officer came to me and told me to follow him in a barn. There he started interrogating me. Who is the visitor? What were they talking about, the visitor and my parents? In the beginning, I was very courageous, especially that my father told me before I left, do not tell anyone about this visitor. But soon I started to cry. I was so afraid. I have many stories. I have horrible ones and I have touching ones. I'm very grateful to you that you asked me to share a few of my stories. And I think that there is one more sentence I would like to share, and that is that many times, even today, I still feel that rage inside me, and I'm thinking a lot whether I should or should not forgive. And I can say that I had so many wonderful stories with the old generations of my native village that I'm on my way of forgiving those who were the dominants. I think I'm on in a good direction. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kinga, and thanks to all of the panelists. And all of you were very, very appropriate in terms of the time limits and very moving in terms of your comments. So thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to pose some of the questions that have been provided to us. And I want to start with our two principal speakers and to ask Zizi and Shondor a question which has been asked repeatedly in one form or another by people here. And that is, what are the principal lessons that you would bring to the present from the history that you've recounted to us? What wisdom can that history provide us for how we live today? Zizi, Shondor, either of you.
Zizi, nem vagy bekapcsolva a hangod.
Zizi, do you want to go first? Be sure to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Or Shondor, do you want first? Shondor, history. Okay. Having lived in communist era, it is something that I should call your attention. Why there were the two generations, my father's and my generation, had a very different experience. So to look as a general principle is not quite right. While my father had the ultimate victim, as I had described, my generation enjoyed all the privileges of communism. Very strange, very controversial, but I went to schools, past schools, music and then medicine, and specialized whatever I wanted for free. Then we were provided guaranteed jobs, well, jobs in Romanian territories, but jobs and a salary and housing and healthcare for free. Now, it was this evil system. While I sometimes think of America, very talented people had no access to all of this. During communism culture, we were locked. We did not make money, but we did not need really money, but we had culture, and that was culture, being cultured, educated. That was the top value. So our values were so important. Underground literature, everything we cultivated this. There other is the compromising, the issue of compromise. So how do you define compromise? Surely is a terrible thing was in communism, but I thought compromising saved one and victimized the other, and that now what was the right attitude. So compromise now should be also an understanding, a cooperation, especially now in this polarized world. Compromise should be a positive notion. Well,
Great. Thank you, Zizi.
but I stop here.
Excellent. Thank you. Shondor, do you have any observations?
Well, I'm not that wise, but it is very difficult to talk about this period, and we tend to oversimplify things. This is not about good guys and bad guys. This is not a binary system. It's much more complicated, and it is very, very hard to comprehend and understand. I still struggle to understand what was going on. One more sentence. When I first went to Bucharest to study the former archive of the secret police with my colleagues, believe it or not, we all got sick for almost 2 days, what we had to face and had to digest. So it is a very, very painful and not a simple thing.
So let me ask a question which any of the 6 of our speakers is welcome to respond to. And this is a question about theology. And the question is, how do your experiences from the past or in the current day of authoritarian governments, of totalitarianism, how do they inform your theological understanding of evil? That's probably as basic a question as we can ask, but how do we understand evil as a result of the experiences that all 6 of you have either described or alluded to? And unfortunately, we only have 5 minutes left, so your answers must be concise. Who would like to comment on that?
Okay, let me try.
Please.
Having been a teenager during the Marcos years, during the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos, it was very clear to me that evil was it's a constriction of reality. It is something that disables you from actually seeing what is happening. And I'm sorry to use ableist language, but it is something that prevents you from seeing what is, and from going with the discourse. Freely flowing discourse is constrained. So as human beings, we have the responsibility to learn, to constantly learn, so that we adapt as a human race. And we cannot do that if our learning, which should be happening every day constantly through mundane conversations, we shouldn't take for granted mundane conversations. They are opportunities to learn from each other. And if that is constricted by, censorship or, hyper militant police or whatever, we are constricted from evolving. We're constricted from developing ourselves and our neighborhoods and our families. That to me is evil. Thank you. By the way, I failed to acknowledge Claudia. Claudia, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Tet, and thanks to all of you. I'm afraid that our time is almost up, so I'm going to turn this back to Lahel and Claudia for any closing remarks. But I know we're all grateful to the 6 of you for sharing your experience, your wisdom, and your insights with us today. Claudia, Lahel, would you want to close things up for us?
Thank you. And as a last sentence, I would like to say that 65 years ago, on this day, 4 of November 1956, the Soviet armies invaded Hungary and defeated the revolution against communism. And today is a day of national mourning in Hungary. what to say, we don't want to return in a communist regime. It was very bad. What is very important to us for the Hungarian, Romanians in general living in Transylvania, Romania, is the resistance that many brave people have expressed against communism, both as individuals and as communities. Our grandfathers, grandmothers, fathers, mothers lived under communism for more than 40 years. I personally lived for 21 years. Anyone who has not lived in such communist dictatorship can't even comprehend how amazingly difficult this year have been. I say this only because many people in the Western world, including the United States, glorified these communist ideas. But beside the theory, they don't know what it is like in practice. Communism is synonymous with fascism. Thank you.
Thank you, Lahel. Claudia, a final word?
I just want to thank everyone on the panel and our moderator and our presenters, because you have presented what we hoped would happen today. You have spoken from your hearts. You have shared the incredible complexity and pain and an insight into what authoritarianism can mean. And those of us, as an American, I say, we are so privileged to have been spared that, but we also are somewhat ignorant and not knowing the depth of the pain and the suffering that you have undergone. So thank you for sharing it. Thank you for responding. And thank you for being with us today. Goodbye. And I hope on your screen soon you will see the beautiful pictures of Transylvania and how to stay in touch with us and be on our mailing list and help us continue this international reckoning Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian Histories Project. Thank you.